Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are back at Bess Airport in the United States for part 2 of our Microsoft Flight Simulator Flight School series. In today's lesson we'll be starting up the aircraft using the real world checklist, taxiing out to the holding point for runway 26 and then carrying out the engine run-up. I'll leave a link down in the description below for the checklist that I'll be using during this flight. That way you can follow along with all the procedures as we go through them together. I do hope you enjoy the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, please leave them down in the comment section below. But for now, let's jump into the cockpit and begin the lesson. So here we are once again in the cockpit of the Cessna 152, and today we're going to run through the engine startup and the taxi out to the runway. As I mentioned before, we are using the real world checklist for this flight. I'll leave a link for the checklist in the description down below. And today we'll be starting at the before starting engine section of the checklist. So pre-flight inspection has been completed. Passenger briefing, no passengers on board today. Seatbelts and shoulder harnesses are secure. Fuel shutoff valve we turn on. So we come down here and we set the fuel shutoff valve to on. As the name would suggest, the fuel shutoff valve cuts off the fuel supply to the engine, so we wouldn't be able to start the engine without turning that on. Circuit breakers check in. The circuit breakers are all located along the bottom of the panel here. They're not modelled in Microsoft Flight Simulator currently, however they are all in. Radios and electrical equipment off, so checking that each individual radio, as well as the transponder and the ADF, is turned off. We make sure that the radios are turned off before the start because when we're starting the engine, that can produce electrical transients within the electrical system, and that can potentially damage the radios. So by turning them off, we're protecting them from any electrical surges. Brakes test and set. The park brake is on, so the brakes are set. Starting the engine, mixture rich. So we put the mixture full forward, that is in the rich position. Throttle 1/4 inch open, so just crack the throttle. Carburetor heat off, so the carburetor heat is off, that's in the in position. Beacon on. The beacon is the red rotating light on the top of the aircraft's tail. That warns people around us that the engine is either running or that we are about to start the engine. Prime as required. So the primer, as we mentioned in the previous lesson, that allows us to inject fuel straight into the engine cylinders, thus helping us to start the engine, particularly if the engine is cold or it is a cold day. Typically on a normal day like today you'd prime the engine 2 or 3 times, so we'll prime the engine 3 times right now. Battery on. Propeller area clear. So checking all around the propeller that there's no one in the way, no one's going to get hurt. Obviously we have this guy just off our 11 o'clock, but we'll assume he's aware we're about to start the engine. Before we start the engine we would shout clear prop to announce that we are about to start the engine, and then we would start the engine. So flicking it over to start. No joy there, try again. Okay, we have a good start. As soon as the engine starts, we bring the RPM back to 1000. And we check that the oil pressure has risen into the green on the dial. Tends to sit right on the edge of the dial in the Microsoft Flight Simulator model, but we'll consider that is checked. And the reason we set 1000 RPM and not idle on the engine, if we run the engine idle on the ground, then it tends to foul up the spark plugs with an excessively rich mixture and the engine just idling. So as I say, we usually run the engine at around 1000 RPM while we're stationary. That might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but that is the way it's done. So throttle 1000 RPM, oil pressure is in the green. Mixture lean for taxi. I see a lot of checklists calling for leaning during the taxi, and it does seem a very popular thing to do in Flight Simulator as well. Personally, I've never done that in the real world, so we're not going to do that today. Alternator on, so we turn on the aircraft's alternator, which again, if you remember, is very similar to a generator. And we check the ammeter. We can see that there is a positive charge, it's just above the 0, so that means that the alternator is now charging the battery. Ammeter has been checked, flaps retracted, the flaps are at 0, and we can also visually check that on the wing. Navigation lights as required, we already had the navigation lights on. Radios on. We'll just turn on the one radio today, we don't need the whole stack. Transponder 1200 and standby, so there's 1200, and we just turn it on to standby for now rather than leaving it off. That allows the transponder to warm up. Heading indicator set, so we set the heading indicator against the aircraft's compass. So coming up to the compass we have a heading of about just below 170, and coming down to the heading indicator that's showing 169, so we know that the heading indicator is correct. ATIS obtain. As you can see, there is no ATIS frequency here at BERS, so we'll just have to go using the windsock, and we'll set the altimeter via the aerodrome elevation. Altimeter set. So the aerodrome elevation at BERS is 644 feet. So there's 600 feet, and each increment is 20. So there's 640, very close to 644. Traffic, tune, and we'll announce the taxi with them. So that is the startup complete. We'll now taxi out to the runway, and then we'll carry out the run-up checks at the holding point. In terms of deciding which direction we're going to take for the runway, as I said, you can use the windsock if there's no air traffic control. Generally you always want to take off into wind where possible. If you just look at the windsock and see the direction it's pointing in, essentially that is pointing in the direction that you want to be taking off from. So for example today the wind is coming from the west, which means we want to taxi out to the east. Okay, for the taxi, check that the area is clear. We're going to have to do quite a tight turn to avoid this chap here just on our left. Turn the park brake off, feet on the brakes for just a second. You might need just a little bit of power to get the aircraft moving, and we'll straight away use a bit of left brake just to tighten up the turn and avoid this guy. Okay, the wingtip is clear of him. So just before we enter the taxiway, we'll call traffic and tell them we are taxiing for the westerly runway. So we'll select a runway for takeoff, taking runway 26, and we'll announce taxi.
7 Mike Tree traffic Cessna Golf, India Tango Bravo Sierra is taxiing to runway 26.
There's no other traffic coming down the taxiway. And there doesn't seem to be a run-up area here at BERS, so we'll just taxi out to the holding point and then we'll do the run-up there. So when we're taxiing we want to use as little power as possible, and whenever we want to brake the aircraft then we come back to idle power. Otherwise you're just fighting the power of the engine versus the brakes, and you'll wear the brakes out a lot more quickly. Obviously we're steering the aircraft with the rudder pedals, and just using the rudder pedals to keep the aircraft on the centerline. If you do want to tighten up the taxi then you can use a little bit of left or right braking to tighten the turn. So we'll slow the aircraft down now, and as I said we'll make a turn into wind for the run-up. By turning into wind for the run-up it just means that you have more airflow going through the engine, which helps keep the engine cool when you're running at a high power setting during the run-up. And looking at the windsock, that's roughly into wind. So the aircraft stationary, park brake on, engine back up to 1000 RPM. So the before takeoff checklist now. Nose wheel is straight, brakes are set and holding, flight controls free and correct. So next we want to check the flight controls. To do that we just move the flight controls through their full range of movement checking that we get the full range of movement and also the correct response. As we do this, we'll also briefly discuss the various flight controls just to help get you familiar with them. So we'll first check the elevator axis, which is back and forward on the aircraft's yoke or control column. Pull back on the yoke, we should see the elevator go up. And indeed we do see the elevator go up. Fully forward, we'll move the elevator down, and there is fully down. Full left on the yoke, we'll see the left aileron go up. So there is full left, the left aileron is up and the right aileron is down, and vice versa with right aileron. So the right aileron is up and the left aileron is down. Checking the rudder, so full left rudder, we should see the rudder move to the left, and sure enough it does. And full right rudder, we should see the rudder move to the right. And again, it does. Again, we'll discuss more in the air, but very briefly, the elevator controls the aircraft's pitch, the ailerons control the aircraft's bank, or turn, and the rudders control the aircraft's yaw, or essentially the direction in which the aircraft's nose is pointing. The rudder pedals also have the aircraft's brakes located on them, as well as the nose wheel steering on the ground, as you saw. So flight controls free and correct. Fuel shutoff valve is on. Mixture is rich. Another good reason not to lean the mixture, it's just one more thing to forget. So now we're going to do the engine run up and check the condition of some of the systems. We'll briefly discuss all this now because in the real world you want to minimise your time at high RPM as much as possible. So we'll talk through the checklist briefly and then we'll run through the checklist properly. So for the run up we're going to throttle up to 1700 RPM and then we will check the carb heat. So to check the carb heat we will pull the carb heat out, which turns the carb heat on, and we'll check that there is a drop in engine RPM. That shows us that the carburetor heat system is working. As the hot air is put into the carburetor we'll see a drop in engine power. Next we will check the magnetos. So we'll check each magneto system, first the left and then the right, and again we're checking for an RPM drop to show that each magneto system is working correctly. We'll be looking for a drop of a maximum of 125 RPM on each side and no bigger than 50 RPM difference between the two. Then we'll check the engine gauges and the ammeter to check that the engine is running properly and the ammeter is charging the battery. We'll check the suction to check that the vacuum pump is providing the correct amount of suction for the instruments. Then we'll throttle back to idle, check that the engine is running okay at idle and at a reasonable RPM, and then we'll come back up to 1000 RPM once the run up is complete. So we'll now start the engine run up. So as I mentioned, first coming up to 1700 RPM. Of course making sure that the brakes are holding the aircraft. So 1700 RPM. Carburetor heat we'll now check. So you can see there is a slight drop in the RPM, that means the carburetor heat is working. Magnetos check. And again you can see there's a very slight drop there. We go back to both. And we're back up to 1700. And then try the other magneto. And again just a very slight drop and definitely less than 50 RPM difference between the two. So magnetos are checked, engine gauges. So the oil temperature is quite high but it's still within the green, oil pressure is good, and the ammeter is still charging. Suction is within the green arc, so that's checked. Throttle back to idle. So the engine idling at 750 RPM, that's broadly what we'd expect, that's good. Back up to 1000 RPM. Throttle friction nut adjust, so that's actually a nut around the outside of this throttle control, which you can loosen or tighten in the real world just to change the friction of the throttle, but that's not working in the sim. Communications and navigations radio set. So we do have traffic tuned on COM1, we won't be using the navigation radio today, and the transponder is set to 1200. Flight instruments set and checked. So checking the indications on all the various flight instruments. So the airspeed indicator is reading 0, the turn coordinator is correct, the attitude indicator is showing 0 bank and level flight. Once again checking the directional indicator, so that's showing us 238 versus just under 240 on the compass, so again that's correct. Clock, we have the correct time set. Altimeter 644, that's the correct aerodrome elevation. Vertical speed indicator looks good, and once again we're not using any of the navigation instruments. Fuel quantities checked. So we have a left and a right tank quantity, they're both showing just under 50%, which is more than enough for today's flight. Trim set for takeoff. So here we have the trim wheel, that controls a tab on the elevator. The trim tab allows us to reduce loading on the controls so that we don't have to constantly fight the controls to maintain level flight. And we need to check that it is in the takeoff position. Usually in the real world someone will have marked off the exact takeoff position just to make it easier to see, but in the sim, as long as it's somewhere between the middle and this takeoff indicator, I'm sure that's good enough. Flaps set for takeoff. So generally in the 152 we use either 10 degrees or 0 degrees of flaps for the takeoff. Basically flaps help you take off in a shorter amount of space. So if the runway is short, I would recommend using flap. However, on a longer runway they're not required, and they do actually impede your climb performance, so if you're not limited by runway length, you're actually better off taking off without flaps. Cabin doors and windows closed and latched. So checking the doors and windows, they are closed and latched. Seats adjusted and locked, checked. Departure briefing we won't do today, and then we just need to contact the traffic to report the takeoff. So we'll taxi into position at the holding point. So coming back on the throttle, releasing the parking brake, and then again a little bit of power to get the aircraft moving. We'll make a full 360 degree turn here, otherwise it's quite tight to get round to the holding point. So once again you can use a little bit of brake to tighten up the turn, as I am now. And we'll just stop short at the holding point for runway 26. Again set the parking brake, throttle back up to 1000 RPM, and the next section of the checklist will be the cleared for takeoff section. However, we'll stop the video here and we'll come back in part 3, complete that section of the checklist, and then we'll carry out the takeoff portion of the tutorial. So there you go guys, we're now at the holding point for runway 26 and we are ready for the takeoff. Once again I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, please leave them down in the comments section below and I'll do my best to answer them. But for now, thanks very much and I'll see you all again soon.